Mortal Kombat 3 for the Nintendo Game Boy. Meh. Let's recap for a bit. We did Mortal Kombat 1 for the Game Boy last year, a game that is putrid in every conceivable way. The only reason to own that version of Mortal Kombat is to add it to a collection of sorts. You don't actually want to play it. Now, while I've never played Mortal Kombat 2 on Game Boy, apparently it's supposed to be an improvement over the first game, and that's the only thing I could really say in regards to Mortal Kombat 3 for Game Boy. At the very least, it's a step above that first Mortal Kombat attempt on Game Boy, but still not a very good conversion. Although, to be fair, I'd like to think there were some attempt at an effort made to make this MK3 game to be as playable as possible on the Game Boy. It's just not quite up to snuff. For one thing, controls are considerably delayed to a point where attempting to pull off special moves can be somewhat difficult unless you nail the timing down. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of a 1-second lag between input and execution, possibly less, but it is noticeable, and something has to be taken into account when doing anything from simple jump kicks and uppercuts to more complex special moves and fatality commands. It's nowhere near the horrid lag of the first Game Boy Mortal Kombat. At the very least, Mortal Kombat 3 is somewhat manageable, perhaps a bit playable even, to an extent, but it's still very much a struggle to get anything done in a timely manner. You have to plan your inputs ahead of time in order to get everything done properly. There's some other quirks in the gameplay department that somewhat hinders Mortal Kombat 3. Jump kicks, for example, are apparently a lot weaker here as they no longer knock down an opponent like they did in traditional Mortal Kombat video games. The fighters here move about in a somewhat sluggish nature. I'm not talking jerky or choppy or anything of the sort, nothing that bad. They just move really slow, almost as if you're running a computer game on a machine that fails to meet the required specifications. There are some command changes for certain moves, which is to be expected because you have fewer buttons on a Game Boy. Here's some other worthless information about Mortal Kombat 3 for Game Boy. You're only given 8 of the arcade game's 15 playable Mortal Combatants to choose from. 9 if you input the code to unlock Secret Fighter Smoke, which is actually fairly simple since the game gives you the opportunity to input whatever combat codes you come across before each match. And they mostly match those of the arcade original, so if you happen to have any combat codes for the arcade game and home versions, they'll work here no problem. Some of them at least. Like the arcade original and subsequent home console conversions, you can choose to challenge one of 3 combat towers, although Motaro, the 4-legged centaur sub-boss, is omitted entirely, which leaves only Big Bad Shao Kahn as the big boss of this conversion to defeat for ultimate victory. Each combatant has a fatality and a babality to finish opponents. There are no stage fatalities of any kind to be found in Mortal Kombat 3, but you can still uppercut opponents through the floor on certain stages, of which there are 5. Making your fighter run is done by pressing towards and both punch and kick, start blocks, and select pauses. Wait, there's a pause button in a Mortal Kombat game? Ingenious! What will they think of next? For better or worse, the visuals of Mortal Kombat 3 can be described as somewhat decent at best. It's not the greatest looking piece of work ever conceived, but at the very least you can easily make out all the characters in all the different locales. And there's actually a fair bit of detail to the character sprites, perhaps more so than previous MK efforts on Game Boy. The various locales look pretty decent for the most part, all things considered. Coloring looks a bit odd though, might be the choice of colors generated on the Super Game Boy when I was playing it, but just seems to have something of an odd look that I cannot quite explain. I suspect, however, the game looks better in black and white than it would on a Super Game Boy randomly generated 4-color palette. I'd hate to see how this would look on a Game Boy Color, but that's just me, your mileage may vary in this regard. Other than that, however, Mortal Kombat 3 at the very least looks the part. Unfortunately, sound doesn't fare any better on Game Boy. Just about the only positive that comes to mind is that the jarring collection of noise that is supposed to represent music at the very least attempts to recreate the tunes of the arcade game, and in fairness does a fairly close job in that regard. But even that point is marred by the fact that the music just sounds horribly mangled and could easily be described as what one would call ear rape central. I'm sure some folks wouldn't mind this auditory mess, and that's perfectly fine. I happen to not be one of them. Here's the good news. Mortal Kombat 3 on the Game Boy is better than Mortal Kombat 1 on the Game Boy. Not necessarily by a considerable margin, but still a step above or two that earlier version. Sure, the game has laggy controls, but never to the extent of the first game, and at the very least the action, while still somewhat sluggish, is nowhere near as jerky or unresponsive as the first game. With that having been said, however, Mortal Kombat 3 on the Game Boy is not a particularly good fighting game and probably wouldn't have been the best choice for Mortal Kombat on the go. There's some quirks about this one that makes it a subpar conversion job at best. I'd like to believe though that the developers did try to put out the very best product they could, and in a way, it does feel like it could have been a somewhat decent handheld Mortal Kombat had a number of issues been resolved. As it is, this is merely a mild curiosity piece for Mortal Kombat collectors, but really nothing worth tracking down.